This episode is brought to you by Netflix. So Netflix is basically Santa this year. 2 NFL games on Christmas Day, streaming live. At 1 p.m. Eastern, it's Cowboys, Commanders. Then at 4:30, you've got Lions, Vikings. Midwest football, playoff stakes, and probably some snow. Watching holiday football is a tradition the whole family can enjoy. Open some gifts, grab some food, settle in, and watch NFL Live on Netflix this Christmas Day.
This episode is brought to you by McAfee.
Swimsuit, passport, phone, with VPN activated.
VPN?
Cell phone service is going to be spotty on vacation, so we'll be using public Wi-Fi.
Sounds sketchy.
Exactly. The networks can leave your personal info, like credit card numbers, exposed to hackers.
McAfee's secure VPN lets you browse and bank safely from wherever, whenever. Learn more at McAfee.com/online protection.
Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute, and the sponsor for this episode is the Georgian Papers Program.
Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 172 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. Spying constitutes one of the oldest professions in the world. In fact, it's an activity that governments have been engaged in for centuries. For instance, both ancient China and ancient Rome had extensive and well-organized spy networks. Now, today in our own 21st century, intelligence gathering still plays an important role in the foreign policy decisions of many nation-states, including the United States, which raises the questions: how and when did the United States set about establishing its own foreign intelligence service? To answer these questions, we'll need to journey back to the American Revolution. Kenneth Dagler will facilitate our mental time travel today and lead our investigation into this topic. Ken is an intelligence professional with 33 years' experience managing human sources and collection, and he's the author of Spies, Patriots, and Traitors, American Intelligence in the Revolutionary War. Now, during our investigation, Ken reveals the basic concepts of intelligence gathering and the origins of the American Foreign Intelligence Service, how revolutionary groups like the Sons of Liberty developed intelligence gathering capabilities, and information about the intelligence gathering efforts of both the British and Continental armies during the American War for Independence. But first, be sure to sign up for the Ben Franklin's World Listener newsletter. Every week, it sends the show notes for the new episode right to your inbox. And on occasion, I use it to send you notices about meetups and other cool news of interest. Signing up is really easy. All you need to do is text BFWorld to 33444 or visit benfranklinsworld.com. All right, are you ready to discover the origins of American spycraft? Let's go meet our expert guide.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Our guest is a recognized expert in the intelligence community with 33 years broad experience in management of human sources and collection. He spent 19 years working for the Central Intelligence Agency, and in recent years, he has used his expertise and graduate degree in history to serve as a consultant to the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C., and to author the book Spies, Patriots, and Traitors, American Intelligence in the Revolutionary War. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Kenneth Dagler.
Thank you. Very good to speak with you.
Now, in the introduction to Spies, Patriots, and Traitors, Ken notes that he interacted with many foreign intelligence officers in his work as a senior case officer in the Central Intelligence Agency, and that many of these officers looked upon the American Foreign Intelligence Service, the CIA, as being new to the game. Ken, could we start by discussing the early history of the American Foreign Intelligence Service? Just how old is this service, and how far back in history do we need to go to find the origins of the first foreign intelligence services?
Well, let me address your latter part of the question first, because I was in one of the oldest professions in the world. And the early descriptions of spying go back to the Old Testament. Any nation state, for example, the Romans had an incredibly well-organized intelligence collection system, as did the Chinese. Any nation state would have had this, although it often depends on whether it was individual spies reporting back or whether there was some type of an organizational structure to analyze and collate the information. So spying goes back to almost when there were three people who wanted to keep a secret between two of them, and the third was trying to find it out. Now, the second point about the American intelligence organizations, that's a little bit complicated, like about everything regarding spying. The historical section of the CIA tends to view the first American spy organization as a group of guys called the Mechanics, who actually were an outgrowth of the Sons of Liberty. Paul Revere is very much connected with this group, and they formed in about September of 1774 with the objective of learning the plans and intentions of the British commanding general Gage in Boston. Their actual leaders were two very important members of the Sons of Liberty, Dr. Benjamin Church and Dr. Joseph Warren. And they were very active in terms of having sources inside Gage's official family so that they were able to pinpoint things like what area would be raided during the Concord and Lexington situation and what have you. Now, the U.S. Army, on the other hand, looks at the start of their military intelligence organization being a little bit later, and that is in 1776, when a reconnaissance group known as Knowlton's Rangers was formed out of a Connecticut cavalry group under the direction of George Washington. And by the way, Nathan Hale belonged to this group. And then finally, if we look at George Washington's official papers, once he took over command of the Army in Boston and turned it officially into the Continental Army in July of 1775, we find that his third or fourth day there is a notation in his official book that he has just paid a certain amount of money to send an individual into Boston to do spying. So you've kind of got three choices of how it actually started.
Okay, so we have three different dates and actions that we could choose to date the origins of the American Foreign Intelligence Service. But when we put all of these actions into the broader historical context of the 18th century, just how sophisticated was intelligence collection in the early United States and in other governments?
Well, the basic aspects of how to collect intelligence and run intelligence activities, as I said, have a deep and long history. So the elements of the basic concepts were known. It's more the culture they were involved in and the type of technology they had. By the time you got to the 18th century, for example, while they certainly didn't have radio or anything like that, the human sources were the primary source of access to intelligence information. Writing was very important in terms of communicating it versus simply word of mouth. Consequently, the technology that was probably the most modern used at that time, once sources were recruited and put in position to provide intelligence, was the use of secret writing, chemical type of things in those days referred to in general as stain for various chemical compositions, and the use of encryption, either numeric encryption or alphanumeric encryption, or the use of some type of code, or in some cases the use of what they called masks, which were pieces of paper with certain parts of them cut out, put over letters, where the actual message would be read by reading the specific word identified in the open space on the mask placed over the paper.
You mentioned that the basic concepts of intelligence collection have remained pretty consistent throughout the centuries. Would you tell us more about these basic concepts and methods? I mean, how exactly do spies collect intelligence?
Sure, they really, as I said, are very historic. You've got to identify what the target is. Do you want to know military information such as who is over the next hill or in the next town? Do you want political information about the plans and intentions of a political element? Do you want to know the strategic or tactical moves about to be made by the military leader? Those tend to be the targets. How do you collect them? Well, again, nowadays, of course, we have things like satellites and drones and radio intercepts. In those days, they had basically observation, they had elicitation capabilities, they had debriefings of deserters, prisoners of war, and spies. And of course, they had the written reports of spies who, by the nature of their professed loyalties or their positions or their physical location, gave them access to that type of information.
Now, before George Washington functioned as the senior intelligence officer for the Continental Army, he collected intelligence for the British Empire. Ken, Would you tell us about Washington's early experiences with intelligence gathering?
Of course, you've got to talk about George Washington anytime you talk about the Revolutionary War. This is an individual who, as the commander of the Continental Army, had a unique role that could never be duplicated today simply because the economy of scale he was involved in. He was not only the chief consumer of all the intelligence produced, he was also the chief operations officer, who literally was a micromanager in terms of telling his collectors exactly what he wanted from them. During the French and Indian War, he demonstrated a great many capabilities: observation, various human skills such as debriefing, elicitation, interrogation, interviewing, whether it was French officers, whether it was deserters, whether it was simply fellow officers who had been in the battlefield, or individuals who had lived behind enemy lines or passed through enemy lines. And he kept extremely accurate records of all of this. His order of battle was something he was extremely proud of because of his disciplined nature. The two traits I would say most important in this regard for Washington was, number one, he was a very disciplined person in everything he did. And number two, although he tended to lack a formal education, he had what we call today critical thinking skills. He really analyzed the steps he wanted to take, analyzed the basic aspects of how you collect intelligence, and then applied a great deal of discipline and close scrutiny to them.
Ken, in Spies, Patriots, and Traitors, you note that at the start of the Imperial Crisis, those we now view as the revolutionaries created something called United Front organizations. And you identify the Sons of Liberty as one of these organizations. Would you tell us what a United Front organization is and why you identify the Sons of Liberty as one of these organizations?
Right. This is an area that most historians, I feel, have ignored. The United Front organization is nothing more than a mass political organization. However, when you add the intelligence overview towards it, it's a mass organization that is slowly developed with as large a base as possible, using a common thread that appeals to everybody, but then slowly, over a period of time, allows a small group of individuals who have a very specific objective to coordinate, communicate, find like leadership, and create a very single purposes that seems to have a mass appeal. Now, most Sons of Liberty are considered to be mob people, drunken people rioting in the street. And there's a beautiful woodcut that seems to have been circulated in America after the Boston Tea Party that shows individuals pouring tea down a tar and feathered British official. And the faces on them are so grotesque to once again indicate that they're nothing but the unwashed mob. Well, admittedly, from 1765 and the Stamp Act until about 1770 and the Boston Massacre, as well as some confrontations that took place in New York City over the Liberty Pole, a lot of mass action was used, a lot of intimidation of the crowd of merchants, a lot of that used for the Sons of Liberty to put forward their opposition to British administration. But early on, the only historian that I'm aware of that really picked up on this point is Pauline Muir, who wrote a book called From Resistance to Revolution. And she was the first person to really sort of point out that the Sons of Liberty had much more of a political organization, much more of a coordination than people give it credit for. And really the individual behind this, who worked very hard at this for about 7 years before it came to fruition, was Samuel Adams, an individual who is given lip service as one of the founding fathers, but I think not given quite the credit he deserves for producing a type of political organization that had coordination, went out and recruited publishers to make sure that all along the coast, from all the way from Boston down to Charleston, virtually every individual that put out a newspaper was a member of the Sons of Liberty, and by 1772 was putting out the same political point of view on all of the issues that were going on. Their propaganda efforts were remarkable. They were so good that in the case of the Boston Massacre, in the case of the Boston Tea Party, and even in the case of Bunker Hill, they were so organized that they could get their perspective in written form sent to England often 2 and 3 weeks before the official report ever came through, so that they could affect public opinion in Great Britain on their perspective of how those actions took place. And of course, by the time you move into the 1773 period, you've got Sons of Liberty literally running the committees of safety, running the mechanics, running the militia, running the various organizations and the towns and cities that are replacing British rule. So they were a very impressive United Front organization.
Samuel Adams really is one of those names that we know, but don't seem to know a whole lot about. So would you tell us more about Adams and his role in the Boston Sons of Liberty organization?
Samuel Adams, again, was a unique organizer who as early as 1765 recognized that political independence from Great Britain was something that he wanted and he felt was necessary. Obviously, most people did not feel that way at the time, so he had to keep his views much more moderate in terms of simply opposing a certain type of taxation or some of the other government actions that were taken against the colonies. He was an individual who, by the time we start the Continental Congresses, was considered to be a bit too radical, so he helped bring in his relative, John Adams, who has gotten most of the credit for basically leading the Boston group. Sam Adams was also very important in terms of recognizing that you needed somebody from the middle colonies, i.e. George Washington, to be a leader in the armed conflict so that you could unite the North and the South and middle colonies. There was quite a cultural divide between those in terms of how they saw themselves and basically what their cultures and their economic aspects were.
Now, you mentioned that the Sons of Liberty were very effective at controlling American presses and producing propaganda. How does propaganda fit with an intelligence collection, and what other tactics did the Sons of Liberty engage in with their intelligence efforts?
Well, propaganda is very important, among other reasons, not only within the United States, to constantly develop the base and constantly support the concept of an organization like the Sons of Liberty representing the desires of the people in the colony. It was important in Great Britain at the time because you had many individuals who were trying to support what they call the Whig or more liberal point of view in Parliament. An example of that is the fact that even the name Sons of Liberty comes from a parliamentarian, Isaac Barré, who in a speech from Parliament defending the actions of the Americans opposing the Stamp Act and that type of taxation noted that they were indeed the Sons of Liberty in the colonies. So the political aspects of it and propaganda was influenced both domestically and abroad.
Now, Howard would like to know more about intelligence collection and what it looked like as the American Revolution turned to war. Would you tell us more about the collection strategies employed by both the revolutionaries and the British Army during the early stages of the conflict?
Certainly. Let's start with the British Army. The British Army had its own responsibilities for intelligence that were primarily on land. And the senior British officer tended to be the individual who analyzed personally or with his small staff all of the intelligence obtained. His senior intelligence officer normally was called his adjutant general. And we know, for example, the names of a couple of them. We always think about Major Andre, John Andre, who was hanged as a spy in the Benedict Arnold conspiracy. He was General Clinton's senior intelligence officer. Now, unfortunately, because of the way the British system operated, you didn't necessarily need to have any professional capabilities in that regard. And Andre, frankly, stands out as an individual who was unsuited for the type of work that intelligence analysis and operations required. He simply was a very good staff officer who knew how to please his senior people. For the British Navy, within the Admiralty, they had their own intelligence service, their type of spies, and the coordination was not terribly good between the Army and the Navy. And then we get to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Great Britain, which from a political point of view also had their spies who did collection, although this was primarily in Europe and not much in the colonies. During the war, it was primarily the Army that was involved in the spying. Interestingly enough, for the first American diplomatic mission abroad, the Paris Commission run by Ben Franklin, that was a target of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and they were able, through their local embassy in Paris, to totally penetrate the Paris Commission. For the Americans, it was a little bit simpler because there were only really two established bodies that represented the new government, if you will. One was the Continental Congress, and they did very little. They had the Committee of Secret Correspondence, which communicated covertly with supporters in Europe and a few in Great Britain. Primarily, collection was done by the Continental Army, and that would have been George Washington, utilizing his small family, as he called it, his secretariat in the Army, and a few key leaders such as Benjamin Talmadge, who was one of his key intelligence professionals who ran the Culper Ring.
The War for Independence lasted for more than 8 years. And when we look at military tactics, we see that both the British and the Continental armies made adjustments and improvements over the course of the war. Did intelligence collection likewise improve and evolve as the war progressed?
I would say it didn't happen much in the way of improvement for the British because the British just continued to do what they do. There was a certain cultural arrogance in the British system that felt it didn't have to adapt to the local culture, if you will, something we know a great deal about as Americans because we're somewhat insulated as a culture. So they ran their spies and they ran their communications with the loyalists, the Tories, if you will, pretty much on the same basis as always, getting what information they could, paying when they had to, counting on some type of loyalty whenever possible, and of course using observation and what cavalry they did have to do their battlefield collection. The American system did improve greatly, and I think a lot of this has to do with the fact that by December of 1776, when Washington made his move to go into Trenton and then Princeton, he did this primarily because he felt he had the intelligence necessary, where for once he had enough knowledge to use intelligence as a force multiplier. Interestingly, after that, as we move into the early period of 1777, Washington starts to set up his advanced intelligence operations. He uses Major John Clark and another individual from Delaware to set up picket lines around Pennsylvania, primarily focused on Philadelphia. He then has them start to recruit agents who can observe those picket lines, live in those locations, and eventually he has them recruiting agents who are going into Philadelphia to gain information on what the British occupation looks like. And of course, he also has an intelligence operation under a female Quaker, quite prosperous and socially prominent one, Linda Darragh, operating in Philadelphia itself. He also then starts to worry about New York City, recognizing that it's going to be the base for the British headquarters, and he starts to set up the Culper Ring, as well as using other spies going into that. And with the Culper Ring, we get to the point where we have the most sophisticated operation that the Continental Army under Washington runs, which is a multi-source operation for collection with very sophisticated ways of communication and couriering things and separating the sensitive collector from the actual intelligence user themselves.
You know, I'm glad you brought up the Culper spy ring, because thanks to that popular television show on AMC called Turn, Washington Spies, many of us have heard about the Culper ring. So after we talk about our episode's sponsor, I wonder if you would help us separate fact from fiction about this spy network by telling us about the real Culper spy ring and how it formed. History and archival work go hand in hand. Letters, journals, and diaries are just some of the key records that historians use to better understand the past. In fact, researchers spend hours examining and transcribing these records, all to help them see particular moments of the past better. And they spend lots of time and money traveling to archives to conduct their research too. Now though, research is getting a bit easier and a bit cheaper as more and more archives are digitizing their records and putting them up online so that anyone with a computer can examine them. In fact, the Omohundro Institute, the producer of Ben Franklin's World, is a primary partner in one such project to put the entire archive of the Georgian monarchs online. Locked for over a century in the Round Tower at Windsor Castle, the papers of the King Georges, George I, II, III, and IV, as well as of King William IV and all their family members and advisors, are now in the process of being digitized. And historians have only seen a small fraction of what is in the some 350,000 items in this collection. Now, the Georgian Papers program is actually a great opportunity for all fans of history, because soon you can explore these records for yourself, and you can help historians and archivists transcribe these handwritten documents as they continue to come up online. If you enjoy exploring handwritten historical documents, you should sign up to be among the first in the Omohundro Institute's team of citizen transcribers. To become a citizen transcriber, visit benfranklinsworld.com/transcribe. Okay, let's talk about the Culper ring. Ken, would you tell us about the real Culper spy ring? How did it form and when did it operate?
The Culper spy ring actually started in mid-1778 when Washington decided he wanted to have a resident reporting structure set up in New York. He recognized that since the British were leaving Philadelphia, they would obviously maintain New York as their base of operations, primarily because they could always control it due to their sea power. So he started working with Benjamin Talmadge, a Connecticut cavalryman whose unit was located up around Long Island Sound, opposite Long Island in Connecticut. And between them, they worked out the recruitment of two principal agents. One was Abraham Woodhull, the other was Robert Townsend. These individuals, in turn, recruited often relatives, but certainly friends and individuals, both in the countryside and in New York City, who had access to the British through various ways. Let me give you one example of a lovely character named Hercules Mulligan, who was a tailor. And because he was a very good tailor, he was a tailor to British high officials, both military and civilian. Got all of his material and all of his styling manuals directly from London, and all of the officials wanted the most prestigious styles possible. So he established a salon where they would come and talk, and he would simply overhear what they talked about. And because they were all gentlemen and therefore would never betray each other, they talked about openly secrets that were of vast importance. His brother also happened to run a commercial business where he provided supplies to British officials. Another source of information in knowing exactly what the supplies were, which might indicate where they were going to be used, how many men might be used, the type of shipment requirement, what the end point was to be for delivery of the goods, etc. All very good logistics intelligence. And the culprit ring had several people like this operating. For example, Robert Townsend ran a coffee shop that was another venue for senior officials, military and civilian, to gather and talk openly and friendly about what was going on within the command. He also established safe houses at which information could be dropped off by the collectors in town and then picked up subsequently by people traveling in from the countryside on legitimate business who had to stay overnight and were able to then reduce that information into small notes or often into stain, secret writing, simply into other ways of hiding it in concealment devices, take it back through British lines to take back out to Long Island, where they were able then to send it across Long Island Sound over to the Connecticut Light Dragoons, who would subsequently take it onward to Washington. I should mention that Turn is a very good dramatic representation of the Revolutionary War, but its use of the characters is not really what they did. It's for dramatic effect, and their timeline and discussion of the supposed collection activities and what have you, again, are played to dramatic effect. I feel particularly sorry for one particular character, Anna Strong, whose real role was a very vital role, signaling through the use of laundry sheet hung out on a hill to a whaleboat in Long Island Sound when intelligence had been placed in various dead drops and should be picked up. She's portrayed in a more romantic and sort of immoral manner than probably she should. I have to say that the two best characters, to my way of thinking, are the two most evil individuals, the British officer Simcoe and Robert Rogers, both of whom are incredibly evil, and I sort of like the way they play that.
Now, John would like to know how the intelligence gathering tactics used by the Culper Ring compared to the intelligence gathering tactics used by the British Army in New York City. He'd also like to know whether the Culper Ring's tactics influenced the British, or if British tactics influenced those employed by the Culper Ring.
Again, we get back to the fact that the tactics are kind of basic and well known. The difference would be that the British Army was situated in one location, whereas the American forces had a Northern Army, the main army, and a Southern Army. Consequently, they were more dispersed, and because communication at the time took a long period to coordinate, individual officers in those armies often made decisions and took actions well before it could literally be reported. The American Army had a slightly easier time because by late 1778, they focused most of their high-level intelligence collection on the command center itself in New York, so it was somewhat easier for them. The British did have the advantage that even in the hinterland outside of New York, there were still some Tories, legitimate Tories, who had never given up political loyalty to the crown, so you certainly can't refer to them as traitors, but individuals who were more than willing to send messages whenever possible on what was occurring in their particular area. Now, I do want to contrast this with somebody like Benedict Arnold, because Benedict Arnold was a simple traitor. He was an individual who wrote to the British wanting money and a deal for his treachery. Consequently, he was not someone that the British actually looked to. The British did indeed have a list of some Army officers who they felt perhaps they could contact. And some letters were sent with no result. But Arnold was never on that list. Arnold was a complete volunteer.
You know, we've talked a lot about Northern case studies of intelligence gathering. Yet, in Spies, Patriots, and Traitors, Ken reveals that one area historians have understudied is the intelligence work of Nathaniel Greene in the War's Southern Department. Ken, would you tell us about Nathaniel Greene and his intelligence work?
That's something I found very fascinating because we tend to concentrate as historians on sort of the northern colonies and the southern colonies in the war, primarily because in the South, except for a few big battles, they weren't of great strategic importance. Yet General Greene, when he took over the Army in 1780, he learned most of his tactics and most of his way of command from General Washington. He also learned his handling of intelligence matters. Luckily for us, he was a little less careful in his operational security in his papers than George Washington was. If you very carefully read the 13 volumes of his official papers, you'd be able to identify well over 25 intelligence officers he utilized, and many of the agent networks he did utilize, because Greene had to fight a war of movement. He never had enough troops that he could stand up to Cornwallis and the British forces that were available in the Carolinas. Consequently, he had to be able to react. He had to know what the British were going to do and how they planned to do it so that he could skirmish when necessary, but more likely move his forces away so that he didn't lose them in any type of irregular battle. And he had some excellent people working for him. He had people like the Swamp Fox himself, Francis Marion, as well as his intelligence officers. He had John Laurens, an individual who previously had been an aide to General Washington. He had Thomas Sumter, a South Carolina officer, and he had Light Horse Harry Lee. So he had some very competent people working for him that allowed him to harass and eventually, at the Battle of Cowpens, destroy Cornwallis's capability for any type of reconnaissance or protection of provisions and forage, which actually forced Cornwallis to then move out of the Carolinas and into the Tidewater, setting up the set-piece battle at Yorktown.
We've heard a lot of examples about intelligence gathering that worked. If you're a commander like Nathaniel Greene and you gather your intelligence about your opponent, Charles Cornwallis, correctly, then you're able to know when and where to move your army to confront him. But what happens when intelligence gathering goes wrong? What were the consequences of getting and acting upon bad intelligence or misinformation during the Revolution?
Well, and this is a concern that is always there with any intelligence operation, and certainly well known to both the British and to George Washington. And they were very careful about this. What happens is that you face a human condition here. One of the basic laws of intelligence is that decision makers tend to support intelligence that represents their preconceived views. This creates a bit of a problem, but it's a human nature thing you're never going to get over. One of the aspects of the Benedict Arnold conspiracy is that General Clinton and his adjutant General John Andre moved so slowly in accepting Arnold's position because they simply were afraid that an individual like himself, with as much of a famous reputation in the American Army, could never really be a traitor. He was a gentleman. How could he be a traitor? Consequently, they tried to test him and to some degree ignored him until they were able to find out that he had just been convicted in a court-martial and reprimanded by Washington, and therefore he indeed had been vulnerable to a desertion. So the whole concept there of being aware of spies was very, very obvious to both sides. Washington was very careful in how he handled most of his decisions regarding intelligence. He kept it very closely held. Another example within the Arnold conspiracy that is somewhat ironic is that the information that Arnold sent to the British command that really convinced them that he was willing to betray his country was information about a plan that George Washington told him regarding a joint French and American attack on Quebec. That information was disinformation that Washington was telling all of his senior generals just as a matter of course, because he believed in operational security.
Now, Michael would like to know more about how spies were portrayed and thought about during the War for Independence. He'd really like to know whether both the British and the revolutionaries were actually wary of spies, and how they treated people they suspected of being spies.
In those days, particularly among the British, but to some degree among the Americans who sort of profiled the British concept of gentleman culture, gentlemen were not spies. Gentlemen could be intelligence officers, but they were not spies. A beautiful example of this is the Nathan Hale operation. People tend to believe that George Washington picked Nathan Hale as his choice to go on this very dangerous mission. In reality, that didn't happen at all. In reality, he asked Thomas Knowlton of Knowlton's Rangers to find a suitable officer to go on this operation. Thomas Knowlton asked a captain, James Sprague, to do it, and James Sprague refused, saying that as an officer and a gentleman, I could never become a spy. Subsequently, it was Nathan Hale who volunteered. Washington liked his intelligence assets. He recognized that they were valuable, but in his writings, there is more than one time when he questions whether they're doing it properly, whether or not they may have personal motivations involved in this. And even at one point, late in the war, he and Talmadge get involved in a discussion as to whether or not they've spent too much money on the Culper ring, and if these people had benefited pecuniary-wise too much from this. So spies, per se, were not held in terribly high regard. Intelligence officers, perhaps a little bit better. In the British aspect, a very fascinating thing occurred with the Paris Commission, where, as I mentioned, the British are totally penetrated by spies. Every time that they'd fire an individual who they felt was a British spy, the next person they'd hire also turned out to be a British spy. But King George simply didn't use a lot of the information coming out of the Paris Commission because he was also afraid that his spies were low-bred individuals who were just using this to gain money from the crown. One other aspect of this, and this is who were the spies? There's some thought that only men were the spies involved in this, and this is not true. There were a lot of women on both sides who were involved in collective espionage, and there were more than a few Afro-American slaves working for the American side that were involved, particularly around Yorktown.
I wonder, did the intelligence that came from these African-American and women's sources receive the same scrutiny and treatment as the intelligence that came from white men? I mean, were intelligence officers extra wary of information that came from either African-Americans or women?
No, not that I found in any way. Both commands, both the British and the Americans, would look at the intelligence and attempt to collate it, but obviously the trust they had in the individual was very important. In the case of Yorktown, we have Saul Matthews, and then we've got James Lafayette, both African-American slaves who work for the French aristocrat General Lafayette. In both cases, he trusted them quite a bit, and their intelligence of a tactical nature was actually very vital in ensuring that Cornwallis stayed where he was in the tidewater until Washington could bring the American and French forces down to set up these siege lines.
Now, John would like to know whether there are any intriguing, unanswered questions about espionage during the Revolutionary War. Specifically, he wonders whether there are any unidentified spies or military sources in the records that we still need to identify.
The answer to that is yes across the board. I think it would be very optimistic to assume that we even know 50% of the spying and intelligence activities that took place during a time, because most of it was simply not documented. There are numerous, hundreds of local folk tales of individuals who were involved in spying, some of which have details in it that would indicate to a professional intelligence officer that there may indeed be some basis for this. But it is the documentation that is the most difficult because Washington was extremely careful about noting who the identities were or the type of activities that they were involved in that produced the intelligence. We see more in terms of the intelligence and what their effect was than we do on actually how it was collected. A couple of beautiful examples. An individual named John Honeyman, who I tend to believe was a spy for Washington and of vast importance during the lead up to the Battle of Trenton. There is a lot of debate about whether or not he really was a spy because there is no documentation, but there is an incredibly detailed oral history of what he did. Other examples regarding this, as I said, are almost too numerous to talk about. I'm quite sure that as we move forward now, particularly up here in New England, where a lot of the older houses are being torn down to build new houses, we're going to find trunks and attics or papers stuffed in the wall or basements are going to tell us an awful lot more about intelligence than we know right now.
Ken, given your historical knowledge about intelligence gathering during the War for Independence, and all of your professional knowledge and experience of having worked in American intelligence and counterintelligence operations over the years, would you tell us whether there are any tactics from the 18th century that intelligence organizations like the CIA still use today?
Sadly, the first point to make is that as soon as the Revolutionary War was over with, the new American country eliminated virtually all of its intelligence capabilities. They didn't think they needed anymore. This happened again after the War of 1812 and happened again after the Civil War. And it really wasn't until World War II that an intelligence structure was allowed to continue at the end of a conflict. So passing along lessons learned was not a structural thing. Now, the type of information and methods used to collection did stay relatively steady from that period because, again, technology didn't advance as quickly as it has in the last couple decades. Primarily, the lessons of how to run a human source, how to compartment them, how to protect their information, how to use communication in a secure manner by secret writing or by concealment device, by use of cryptology or by use of code, the use of dead drops to separate the collector from individuals and couriers, picking it up and then separating it once more before it goes to the identified intelligence officer. All of that methodology was used up into the Cold War, but enhanced by things like overhead photography, radio intercepts, microdocs, the ability to use copy machines, the ability to use miniature cameras, etc. So the lessons learned primarily were something like Nathan Hale. Nathan Hale was unsuited by temperament to be a spy. He was given a mission with no particular objective. He was sent with no cover story, no one to contact, no way of getting his information out. At the CIA, we had often used his story point by point as a teaching lesson to say, here's how you run an operation. You do the exact opposite of what they did with Nathan Hale. You don't have him volunteer in public. You do give him specific instructions. You give him a different identity. You give him a cover story, et cetera, et cetera. So it was more a question of looking at the basics and trying to apply discipline to them than it was anything else.
Now it's time for the Time Warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently.
The Time Warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
In your opinion, what might have happened if neither the British nor the Americans had had spies during the Revolutionary War? What would the absence of intelligence gathering have meant for the revolution and its war?
That's a very good question, and I'm going to enlarge upon that a bit if you'll allow me. First of all, there is no question that in terms of being a force multiplier, intelligence was much more vital to the American side because they never had the exterior communication lines of the sea. They never had the use of a decent navy, and their numbers of soldiers were always smaller than those that the British were able to use. So the use of intelligence is vitally important to them. But let me expand that a little bit to two other things. The first one is the covert support that France gave from 1776 until 1778 when the formal treaty was signed. A front company named Traitors and Company, based in Paris, provided millions of dollars in funds and military supplies, particularly in gunpowder and armament and other military accoutrements that kept the Continental Army in the field for 2 years. Without it, it is seriously doubtful that the Continental Army could have been maintained. There simply was no industrial base and certainly a lack of funds in the colonies at the time, and it needed a powerful ally like France, who for its own reasons disliked Great Britain. The second aspect is Trenton. Trenton was a very important battle, more in the sense of it maintained the army. That victory allowed Washington to raise an army again in 1777 and keep it in the field. Had he lost or had he not done that, it is really questionable whether he could have maintained much in the way of an army. I really believe that one of his decision-making points was that he had more than enough intelligence on the positions at Trenton and subsequently Princeton that allowed him to have the confidence to use his beleaguered troops in one desperate attempt to keep them in the field.
Ken, are you working on any historical research or projects at the moment?
Well, research always continues. You never read enough books. At the moment, I have written a couple articles for an online journal, the Journal of the American Revolution. I wrote a piece on the Reverend John Bardrill, who was an interesting character, an Anglican priest who actually went to Britain and ran a collection system through all the seaports on the British southern coast, where he would recruit American sea captains who would then go and volunteer to work for the Paris Commission in Paris, normally successfully, and then given tasks which allowed them to provide intelligence back to the British. And I've also done something on one of the African-American spies that I spoke of earlier, James Lafayette. There's always been some question as to what degree we know about his exact activities, what is folklore and what is documented. And I basically did a review of all of the documentation and came to the conclusion that while we can definitely prove he was a spy, we really cannot prove too much of how he did it or exactly what his information was, other than that it was beneficial to Lafayette.
Now, if we have questions, or if we happen to come across one of these trunks filled with information about Revolutionary War informants, how can we contact you?
Oh, that would be excellent. Anything you find. I think because of my background, you'll find that I don't have much of an electronic footprint. The best way to contact me would be to do it through my publisher at Georgetown University Press.
Kenneth Dagler, thank you for joining us and for helping us better understand spycraft during the American Revolution.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
The American Foreign Intelligence Service began during the American Revolution, sometime between 1774 and 1776. Now, regardless of whether you believe the service started with the Sons of Liberty or with George Washington and the Continental Army, we see that both of these early American organizations employed the same basic tactics. They identified their targets, military and political information that could help them in their quest to achieve American independence. And then they collected information about those targets by observing their opponents, debriefing prisoners of war, and by employing spies who could either see or hear the sought-after information directly, or who could elicit information from those who did see and hear it directly. Now, once they had gathered the intelligence they sought, commanders like George Washington and Nathaniel Greene had to evaluate the information to decide whether to trust and act upon it, or whether to discard it and wait for more information. Of course, as Ken revealed, evaluating intelligence is a very human process. Humans are inclined to believe the intelligence that most supports their preconceived notions about actions they wanted to take, as well as ideas about where the intelligence came from and whether its collector was trustworthy. Now, good intelligence could bring forth successful military actions, as they did for the Americans at the battles of Trenton and Princeton and at the Battle of Cowpens. But bad intelligence could get you killed, as it did Major John Andre in October 1780, after receiving a convincing letter from Benedict Arnold that showed he would betray his country. Andre secretly traveled to confer with Arnold about a British plot to take the Continental Post at West Point, New York. Now, unbeknownst to either man, they met because the convincing letter Arnold sent contained misinformation from George Washington. Both the British and the Americans conducted a lot of espionage during the Revolutionary War. In fact, as Ken noted, it would be optimistic to claim that we even know about half of the spycraft that took place. What we do know is that American spycraft actually improved over the course of the war. Washington, in particular, became better at figuring out where to concentrate his intelligence-gathering efforts, like around New York City, and then using these strategic locations to establish multi-source resident intelligence networks, like the Culper Ring. These networks provided a lot of intelligence that Washington used to determine his next moves and the moves that the British might make. Of course, as Ken related, the strides Americans made in their intelligence-gathering strategies were practically wiped out after the war, because after achieving its independence, the new United States opted not to pay for the upkeep of spies and intelligence officers. This was a decision that they'd actually continue to make until after the end of World War II. You can find more information about Ken, his book Patriots, Spies, and Traitors, plus notes for everything we talked about today on the show notes page, benfranklinsworld.com/172. You should also visit the show notes page if you're interested in learning more about spycraft in the American Revolution, and about that letter Benedict Arnold sent to the British offering them West Point. Because on the show notes page, I've included a link to the William L. Clements Library at the University of Michigan, which has a wonderful online exhibit about these topics. The Omohundro Institute wants you to join their group of citizen transcribers. To join this important team, which will transcribe the Georgian papers, visit benfranklinsworld.com/transcribe. Production assistance for this episode came from the ever-helpful Holly White. Finally, knowing that decision makers are inclined by human nature to trust the intelligence that most fits their preconceived ideas. If you were placed in a situation where you had to make a decision based on gathered intelligence, how would you work to stay objective? Send your answers to Liz at benfranklinsworld.com, tweet me at Liz Covart, or post a comment in our listener community on Facebook. Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.
Are you interested in the parts of history that remain a mystery? Do you want to learn more about the historical myths and misconceptions used to prop up false belief today? I'm Nathaniel Lloyd. In my podcast, Historical Blindness, I delve into all of these topics, sharing puzzling tales from the past and examining hoaxes, conspiracy theories, and misremembered events that provide insight into modern politics and religion. New episodes every 2 weeks. Find Historical Blindness on most podcast players and platforms.